We are so thrilled to welcome here tonight Kyle Spencer. She is an award-winning journalist, a pro-democracy activist, former New York Times contributor, and author of the critically acclaimed book, Raising Them Right, The Untold Story of America's Ultra-Conservative Youth Movement and Its Plot for Power. It's a behind-the-scenes account of the far right and its efforts to radicalize the country. I believe, Kyle, you've spent a lot of time with people on the extreme right. So I think you told me like 5 years.
Yes, 5 years.
But this is my favorite part of your bio is that Ben Shapiro called your book gross. So that's a ringing endorsement if anybody wants to go and check that out. She's also the founding editor of Reporting Right, a weekly pro-democracy newsletter for local journalists who write about the radicalized right. And she's often appeared on MSNBC, CNN, other news outlets. So we are really, really thrilled to have her here tonight. Did I miss anything? Is there anything else you want to highlight about your background or anything? Okay. Well, so everybody, we did let people ask questions before they joined the Zoom. So I really tried to get into your questions and there's a lot of common themes. So I pulled as many as I could. So we are going to try to get through as much information as we can tonight. We have an hour. This is a very in-depth topic, but please ask questions in the chat as we go, and we'll save a little time to try to get as many as those as we can in. But let's get started. So Kyle, can you just start by for people who may have no idea, like what is Project 2025? What is Christian nationalism? Like, what are we talking about tonight? Can you just give kind of a brief overview of those
Sure.
pretty
Yeah,
extensive topics?
definitely. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and it's so great to see such a big crowd. I feel so optimistic right now that we are going to be able to preserve our democracy in November because we're learning about what the threats are to our democracy and sharing it with our friends. So I'm really excited and exuberant about being part of this learning project and sharing project. So the not so great project is Project 25. I always call it Project 25. Project 2025. It should be called Project 25, but anyway, Project 2025 is a blueprint for the Trump presidency. It is over 800 pages of essentially exactly what the radicalized right wing, which is a very organized ecosystem of organizations and donors and politicians and church leaders, they have come together through the Heritage Foundation, which is probably the most powerful conservative think tank in the country that was started in the 1970s to do this very thing, to have a tremendous amount of power when presidents become get elected, to have a tremendous amount of power about what policies they're going to push, what values they're going to push, what legislation they're going to push, and in some cases, what Supreme Court justices and officials and administrators and appointees they're going to have. So Project 2025 is really seen by the architects at the Heritage Foundation as finishing the job that Trump didn't do. And so we already know that Trump has been enormously harmful to our democracy, in part by being responsible for now stacking the court with faithful Trumpers who are going about systematically destroying our democracy. Of course, overthrowing or discounting Roe v. Wade is, of course, like one of the most important. But 800 pages lays out what the radical right wants. Its organizations that support it are all types of different Christian colleges, Christian organizations that support libertarianism, many people who were in the Trump administration before, people who want to be in the Trump administration in the future. The way in which it relates to Christian nationalism is that this conservative, radical republicanism that we are seeing and that we see as so threatening and violent and anti-democratic and unconstitutional is really a Christian right, Christian nationalist plan. Christian nationalism is this idea that we are a Christian nation, that we were founded as a Christian nation. And that in and of itself is problematic and inaccurate to a large extent and also unconstitutional, but it's really not at the heart of the problem with Christian nationalism. The problem with Christian nationalism is that it privileges Christians, evangelical, radical Christians, not all Christians, it privileges Christians and sees them as the folks who need to rule the country and rule over the rest of us. Christians, white Christians, radicalized Christians, part of this group, they are at the very top of the hierarchy, and then everyone else is below them. And we'll talk a lot about what that looks like in Project 2025 and exactly what that plan is. But the most important thing to first understand about Christian nationalism and what Project 2025 lays out is a plan in which Christians get to express their religion not only for themselves, but get to force other people to live by a Christian value system, a radicalized Christian value system, not just a Christian value system, a radicalized Christian value system, against our will. And one thing that's really, really important to understand about Christian nationalism, it's not Christianity. Christian nationalism is nationalism. It is about power. It's about power. A small minority, they're 10% of the country consider themselves in this group of Christian nationalists. About a third of the country are evangelical. Only 10% are Christian nationalists, or would categorize as Christian nationalists. But there's nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. The Christian part of Christian nationalism is essentially sort of a name that these folks have tagged onto this really atrocious plan for our country to make it more alluring and intoxicating, and essentially to give it a better face. And again, we can talk more about that as we go.
You mentioned white Christian nationalism. So how does white supremacy tie into this movement?
So it's a great question. So traditionally, in our country, when there have been threats to the kind of white Christian power base, there has been an effort to sort of Christianize the opposition. So you see that you see that, for example, with the Ku Klux Klan. You see that this kind of radical Christianism became part of this racism and this white supremacy, and they sort of work hand in hand. Christian nationalism, just like white supremacy, is also based on a very undemocratic, very un-American hierarchical order in which one group of people is inherently superior to another group of people. So if you think about what I just said about Christian nationalism being Christians are at the top of the hierarchy, you can also understand why that relates so closely to white supremacy, and white supremacists and Christian nationalists are such good friends, because they're both groups are essentially saying this group of people founded this country, they are better, they are superior, they're more ethical, they're more moral, they ought to have more power, and then everyone else needs to do what we say. And we don't really like these other people. For both Christian nationalists and white nationalists, there's a sense that everybody else is evil, immoral, unethical, inferior, and on and on and on. So that's how that connection works. And of course, we know that a lot of white nationalist groups and Christian nationalist groups work hand in hand.
I'm going to just touch on this. This is jumping ahead in our questions, but I think you kind of raised it. So you say that Christian nationalism is not the same as Christianity. So you kind of discussed this, but I was being really clear, like so if, there's a lot of people on this call who identify as Christians, there are people that they're talking to identify as Christians, and they may not really understand that, like, what's wrong with Christianity? And we're not talking about Christianity. What are the differences?
Yeah, and it's so important because I'm a person of faith, and I'm sure there are many people of faith in this room. And when I look at the kinds of things that Project 2025 wants to do and that Christian nationalists support, it's not Christianity. And as Reverend Barber in North Carolina often says, these guys don't have Jesus, right? Jesus, the things that they want to cut programs for poor people, to segregate the country, to narrowly define what a family looks like, to cut state and national budgets that cut away at the social safety network, that look at efforts to explore our very spotty past and really to reckon with the racism on our country in the past and going forward. These are all things that are not Christian. These are very un-Christian values. But again, what the radical right has been so good at is using Christianity, some version of Christianity, this kind of harsh, un-Christian version of Christianity, and slapping it onto their bad, unethical ideas and making them more appealing to the average person. Christian nationalism uses fear to get supporters. It uses fear that people's rights are going to be, white people's rights are going to be taken away from them, fear that immigrants are going to take away people's jobs, fear that foreigners are going to hurt the people that are here, and that not only are those folks bad and going to hurt white Christians, but that those people are devilish, that they literally are devilish. It's one of the terms that, and you hear a lot with Christian nationalism, is spiritual warfare, which is the idea that the Christian nationalist leaders tell their followers that not only are we low on the totem pole if we're not Christian nationalists, but we're evil and that we're diabolic and that the devil is working inside of us. And you can imagine that if you tell people that in a church, they will believe, if they are already people of faith and you really pound this into them, they're not only going to be wary of other people, they're going to be scared and grow hate towards other people.
Right. So it's about the division, and it's about othering people and causing that sense of fear and chaos. So I'm just going to ask this really quickly, because I know a lot of people who maybe have like read articles, have heard of the Seven Mountain Mandate. And can you just explain, that's part of Christian nationalism, what that's all about?
Yeah. So the Seven Mountain Mandate was an idea that was kind of floated around in this Christian nationalist ecosystem starting as early as the 1970s. But in the 2000s, as Trump was became president, and even before that, there were a couple of these Christian nationalist leaders. One of them, who you may have heard of, is this guy named Lance Wallnau. And he and this other fellow wrote this book, which basically laid out the tenets of the Seven Mountain Mandate. The idea was that Christians, in their efforts to preserve their close-knit Christian values, had been homeschooling their kids, had been sequestering themselves, had been in these church communities that were very separate from the rest of the country, and that this wasn't good. That what Christians needed to do was actually take over the country, not separate itself. So the Seven Mountain Mandate was this idea that there were 7 mountains in the country that needed to be overcome, that needed to be taken over. There was the economy, there was Hollywood, there was religion, there was media, there was the arts. So it was, the idea with the Seven Mandate was, we need to take over every single part of this country in order to reign supreme and become powerful and able to influence people both legislatively but also culturally. And so when you see Fox News, or you see Christian nationalist films that are out there now, if you see these are all what you'll see is really part of the Seven Mandate idea of, we are going to start inserting our Christian nationalism into the larger culture. You'll see, like, I'll give you one other example. You'll see now, like in the economy, you'll see these banks that will only take money, banks that are just basically for Christian evangelical nationalists, and they won't give to any groups that they would say, are doing anything that they think is progressive or woke or whatnot. So it's really like, if you can live as a Christian nationalist in every single arena of the country, you can be surrounded by Christian nationalist ideology and entities, but also so everybody else is touching it too and starting to be impacted by it.
So I'm going to get to a little bit about Project 2025 and its impacts, but I do want to know, so how was it that like Project 2025 and Christian nationalism became so intertwined?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it takes understanding a little bit about the radical rights ecosystem, which is essentially a very, very close-knit body of, I think I said before, of groups, of donors, of politicians, of Christian groups. So this close-knit group works together, meets together, has gatherings, plans things out. And essentially, when you think of like the radical conservative movement in general, it is made up of these kind of folks who want this skeletal government, anti-communist, and then also these Christian right folks. And they come together with their agendas to push this larger conservative agenda. Project 2025 has many, many authors. And many of the authors come from organizations that are Christian nationalist in nature and in formation, like the Family Research Council, which had an enormous amount of impact on Project 2025. The Family Research Council is an anti-LGBTQ organization that believes that the family is narrowly defines the family, is anti-reproductive rights, and on and on and on. Christian colleges like Liberty and Hillsdale, which are not only segregated institutions, but also institutions that teach things like global warming is not a thing. The United States does not have a spotty racial history. This is another, these Christian colleges have had a very big impact on the writing of Project 2025. So have other groups like the Center for Renewing America, which is also a Christian nationalist organization, and other groups like the Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life organization. So if you think about the folks who wrote it, who got together at a table or, online or however they did it to write this thing out, many of them were from the Christian nationalist community. And that's why you see so much of this, of their value system embedded in the document.
All right, so I'm going to ask this question knowing that there's no way you can tell us about all the impacts of Project 2025. But for people on the call tonight who maybe want to go out and talk to people about this, like, can you highlight for us, like, what are some of the biggest impacts that people will feel in their life if Project 2025 is implemented?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I'll tell you some broad things and then we can speak more specifically. But Project 2025 calls for dismantling same-sex marriage, erasing specialized LGBTQ healthcare programs, sharply curbing the sale of abortion pills, criminalizing pornography. While it doesn't explicitly ban abortion, its goal is to outline policies that will make abortions extremely difficult for anybody and everybody. Project 2025 sees in its understanding of the country we live in, sees us as a Christian nation in which Christian nationalist values need to reign supreme. The Project 2025 wants to cut the federal government by really slenderize or cut down the federal government, which means that it wants to close many departments. It wants to close the Department of Education. It wants to narrowly define the EPA. It wants to basically close the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It wants to nearly get rid of Medicare and Medicaid. It wants to cut funding to VA hospitals. And we can go on and on. We can go on about it in more detail in a second. I do want to say one thing. We'll talk today about all of the different things that Project 2025 says. And the important thing when you're talking about it with your friends is to first identify what they care about. So one of the things that Project 2025 does is it actually plans to fire tens of thousands of federal employees and have them reapply and show, if Trump's elected, their fidelity to Trumpism. That's important to a lot of us who pay a lot of attention to what's going on in DC, but may not be that interesting to your neighbors or to your friends or to family members. I say that because it's really important when you're talking about Project 2025 that you really zone in on what it is that people care about. I think when you're talking about it to parents, the thing that's really important is what this will do to our children. And I think particularly our young women, young people who are struggling or questioning their identity, folks with young people with disabilities. It's also going to be harmful to older members of the community because of what it will do with Medicare and Medicaid. So again, we'll talk about specifics, but as we talk about specifics, I think it's important to just be thinking, well, okay, what do the people in my community care about? If you're talking to folks who really care a lot about the environment, the Project 2025 really intends to question whether global warming is happening at all, and then to greatly reduce any of the efforts to stop it. So that's one thing. But we can get more specific as we go on.
Okay, yeah, we'll kind of dive into that because there was a lot of very specific questions about specific groups, and so we'll touch on as many as we can here. So let's talk about the impact that it would have on people who aren't Christian. What if you're Jewish? What if you're Muslim? What if you're Hindi? If we're going to be having a Christian nationalist country, how would that impact you if you're a different religion?
Right. So first of all, Project 25 pretty explicitly states that this country is a Christian nation and that we ought to live by Christian values. So one of the things it wants to do is make sure that folks of different religions who may impact this vision of the country as a Christian nation don't come here. So one way to do that, of course, is this Muslim ban, which we saw under Trump, and that is something that would come back under Project 2025. But that's not all. One of the best ways to understand what Project 2025 will do for people and how it will impact us is to look at places where Project 2025 is already in existence, where some of the policies have already been passed or been implemented. So where do you want to see that? You're going to see that in these very, very red Christian states where Christian nationalists are already in control of state legislatures. So for example, in Oklahoma, a policy was recently passed where every school has to teach the Bible. Now, it doesn't matter if students are agnostic, if they are Hindi, if they're Muslim, their teachers are going to have to teach them about the Bible. And I want to tell you something about Oklahoma. Something like 30% of fourth graders in Oklahoma can read at grade level. So basically, the folks in Oklahoma are most concerned about introducing the Bible to a bunch of kids who actually can't even read, and the state isn't teaching to read. So that kind of shows you the depravity of these people. Also in Louisiana, what we might have recently learned about is that the 10 Commandments are now going to have to also be in schools. So something like having the Bible taught and the 10 Commandments would really fall under this idea of that we are a Christian nation and we need to educate Christians and we need to prioritize and privilege Christianity. So those are two things that you're going to see that are potentially very harmful. And for non-Christians, of course, if you decide, if you're a radical Christian and you believe that abortion is murder, or you have any views that the LGBTQ community shouldn't exist, these are radical Christian ideas that the rest of the faith community in our country do not hold. So that's another way in which your rights will be violated if you are of another religious belief.
Okay, well, you brought this up, and I have talked to members of the LGBTQ plus community, especially people who are transgender, who are basically told me that they will have to leave the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe you could touch on that too. Like how is this impacting that community, and what the
Yeah.
ultimate concerns?
Yeah.
What concerns would they have?
So because the people that wrote this 800-page document are so savvy, and because they had certain very important uh, prejudices and cruel ideas about what they want for this country, they made sure that there are many different ways in which they could implement these ideologies that they hold. So if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, you are going to face a situation in which you are not going to have protection from any types of prejudices or firings based on your sexual orientation, because any sorts of DEI programs, diversity initiatives, are going to be banned under Project 2025, just as you're seeing them banned in places like North Carolina. The UNC system right now is no longer allowing any DEI programs to happen. And I can go into detail, and I won't because I've seen it firsthand. Black science students no longer being able to accept grant money because it's now illegal in North Carolina. But you're also going to see that if you are a student and you're in schools, there will no longer be the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education. And one of the agencies in the Department of Education that has been so important to both people of color, but also the LGBTQ community, is the Civil Rights Office, where if your civil rights are being violated, you can file a complaint, and the agency, this federal agency, can then really hold your school or your school district or teachers or principals accountable. That will be gone. So those are two ways in which that you will not be protected as if you're in that community.
So I'm assuming that's the same with like housing discrimination. Don't want to rent
Exactly.
in so many ways.
Yeah.
And
So yeah, cutting a lot of these agencies that they want to do. One of the things that will do will cut any sorts of sub-agencies that protect people's civil rights, because they are not interested in protecting people's rights. It's a very like low right. It's people's individual rights is at the bottom of these people's priority list.
And obviously, we've already seen attacks on, healthcare for transgender individuals. I'm in Ohio, it just happened.
Yeah, so that's another, yeah, Julie, that's another great point. So, if you are in any of, federal hospitals, VA hospitals, no longer are you going to be able to get gender specific care. Also, if Medicare, Medicaid will not be able to, you won't be able to get it under those. So it's efforts to defund it, outlaw it, prevent people from filing complaints if they're not protected or if they're violent. So it's across the board.
And then you mentioned attacks on DEI programming. So let's touch a little bit on how this Project 2025 would impact communities of color.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I think this idea that, white Christian nationalists reign superior over the country is obviously one of the first places where you're going to, people of color are going to find their rights violated. As I said before, if the plan is to close down the Department of Education, so the Office of Civil Rights, a sub-agency that enforces civil rights laws and investigates schools who have been accused of discrimination, that will be gone. We know that getting abortions that for all women, but women of color in particular, getting abortions and being able to cross the state lines, it is going to be more and more and more difficult for them to get abortions. And that is going to be, increasingly expensive and sometimes just absolutely impossible. So this is another, when I talked about the diversity initiatives, these are now would be outlawed in states, would be outlawed in jobs, in colleges. So that's incredible effect on people of color. And then in terms of what children are taught, in terms of the way our country looks at itself, in terms of the kind of self-examination that our country is doing right now to explore really honestly our history and to really understand what systemic racism is and what it means to be a country of descendants of slave owners, this will all go by the wayside. The Project 2025 believes and the writers of Project 2025 believe that our pushes, progressive pushes, Democrats' pushes for equity are really racist. They're reversed racism. They believe that white people right now are being persecuted. They really believe this. And so their answer to that is to make sure that we completely abolish any teachings in schools, in institutions, anywhere that we have work to do as it relates to racism in our country. And I want to tell you again, when you're talking to friends about this and they say to you, well, that's not going to happen here, or that you want to point to places where it's already happened. So Florida, and everybody knows that DeSantis has despite whatever challenges he had when he was running against him, is a Trumper, does subscribe to a lot of these ideas. And in Florida right now, teachers are censored. They're not allowed to talk about our racial history. And I was at a conference in Florida in the fall, and I met a professor who was part of the teachers of the University Teachers Union, who told me that she and her colleagues had taken down any signs in their offices, a sign of Martin Luther King, any sign that suggested that they were anti-racist. They had preemptively taken these signs down because it was now illegal in Florida in an educational setting to teach anything that suggested that we were a racist country or had a racist past. A Martin Luther King poster. This teacher had to take the poster down, and her union told her she should do that in order to avoid getting fired, being censored, and potentially being charged. We also know in Florida that they have these don't say gay bills, right? They don't say gay laws now, that students and teachers in schools in Florida are not allowed to say the word gay. A student, I think it was about a year and a half ago, in a high school in Florida, gave a speech, a graduation speech, and it was considered really heroic that the student talked about being gay and about other gay students by never ever using the word gay. And that's not, I think the student was heroic and that was wonderful of the student, but it is so sick and sad that we live in a country where a student who's gay gave a 20-minute speech and never was allowed to use the word gay.
Yeah.
That's coming for us. That's coming for us. If if Trump gets elected and Project 2025 gets instituted, that will be all over the country. These will be federal mandates. So we have to understand these will be federal mandates.
And I want to touch on something I think is, you can tell me if I'm saying this properly, but I think a lot, you're talking about self-censorship, because I think a lot of the language and things is coded, right? They don't come out and necessarily just say, we're going to do this policy that's going to like eliminate any discussion of Martin Luther King. They do it in a coded way that people aren't really sure what's going to happen to them. And so they start self-censoring themselves. They start not teaching because of fear that they're going to be prosecuted, or they're not giving the best medical treatment that they probably should because they're fearful they're going to be prosecuted. Did I say that accurately? Does that?
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the things that people who write about fascism and write about totalitarianism and authoritarianism, what they tell people in society, in communities, is don't preemptively succumb, like don't preemptively obey these orders. And this is what these teachers were doing, and I don't fault them, but this is the position that people get in the fear that an authoritarian regime starts to have, and starts to the kind of fear that it spreads around communities.
Well, let's touch a little bit on just two other quick groups. Like you already mentioned the Department of Ed going away. So obviously students with special needs or disabilities, and then also veterans. And you've kind of touched on that a little bit too, but just maybe quickly a little impact that you would see with those groups.
Yeah, as many of you may have heard, one of the plans is to get rid of Head Start. So getting rid of Head Start, and as those of us who have students who have had disabilities, or know a lot, we all know folks who have friends who have kids have gotten these unbelievable services, right? And that's been through the Federal Disabilities Act, and that has allowed federal money to trickle down to local school districts to help students. We also all know, I know we all know, that all of the research about disabilities now suggests that the earlier a disability is identified in a child, and the earlier the child gets services, the much better chances the child has of reaching their highest potential. So cutting Head Start and cutting those early services is just an absolute gutting of the opportunities that we've been able to give kids with disabilities. Now, we know that this is not a perfect system, and I'm sure everyone also has stories about times when this hasn't worked for students, but the idea is that students should get early service. Again, another thing, if the federal government, if the Department of Education is also shut down, that will also eliminate funding that comes to students later. The whole idea of cutting agencies is to stop the flow of funding. It's to stop the funding that we believe believe communities ought to have if we believe in a social safety net. So that would be another. And then the VA hospitals, there is an effort to reduce what VA hospitals can offer. There's going to be an effort to reduce their budgets so that they have less money to work with. And I would say those are probably sort of the two. And then of course, VA hospitals will not be allowed to do any kind of gender-related care.
And you mentioned cutting Medicaid and Medicare,
Yes.
Social Security. I know you mentioned just social safety nets in general being on the chopping block. Is there anything specific about Social Security or anything?
I mean, I think that like basically what we have to look at is that anything that is considered a service to people who are in need is on the chopping block, because part of this is kind of a tangent, but it's important. One of the things that Christian nationalists believe is that if you are wealthy because God wants you to be wealthy. And if you are poor because God wants you to be poor. So if you are a Christian nationalist, why in the world would you support a government which took money through taxation and gave it to needy people when you disdained those people and believed that God did not actually favor them? Why would you favor them if God didn't favor them? It's a very, very cruel way of viewing the world, and a very cruel, cruel way of being in community.
So now we know that the public's starting to learn about Project 2025 and Trump's backing away from it. And the Heritage Foundation has announced some changes, and it's all really trying to confuse people. So can you explain what's really going on there, and what is a Trump referenced Agenda 47? Like what's going on?
So Agenda 40 is basically like a watered or, sort of like a watered down version of Project 2025. It's essentially like his Project 2025. And that's, if you hear him talking about it, it's as if Project Project 2025 is the actual roadmap, and Agenda 47 is like the broad points. So that's how that works. But you have to understand a few things about Project 2025. First of all, we all know that Trump is a liar. Trump lies. He lies, he lies, he lies. So there's no reason why we should ever believe anything that Trump says. But let's say you're talking to people and they say, well, I don't believe anybody. Well, here's the reality about Project 2025. The person who oversaw Project 2025 was Paul Dans, who was a top official in Trump's White House. And he has previously said he hopes to work for his former boss again. Another contributor to Project 2025 was Mark Meadows, former White House chief of staff, Mike Flynn, national security advisor for Trump, Stephen Miller, a former advisor and current advisor to Trump. And about 20 pages are credited to some of these people. 6 of his former cabinet secretaries helped and collaborated on the document. In fact, according to CNN, who did an extensive research of all of the names that were attributed to Project 2025 and those who had been working with Trump, 140 people who worked in the Trump administration had a hand in Project 2025. And again, that is according to a CNN review. To further understand, when CNN looked online at the biographies of all of the folks who had been associated with Project 2025, they found more than 1,000 people listed on published directories for the 110 organizations on Project 2025's advisory board. So Project 25 had individual writers, and then it had all of these organizations that put their name on it because they had impacted what was in the document. 1,000 people were connected both to the Trump administration and to the organizations that had slapped their brand on Project 2025 and said, this is our plan. We love this plan. So
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's evidence. Just give people the numbers and go to the CNN article, and it's a great thing to send people if they, one of the things I highly recommend is show, don't tell. There's so many fabulous descriptors, including some of the stuff that Red Wine and Blue is doing. There's some great videos, articles like the CNN article. Show, don't tell, because we know some of our friends don't want to hear long tirades from us. They want to see stuff. They want to watch a video. Again, your friends, and the people in your community, and the best way to communicate with them.
Actually, there was a lot of questions that came in were like, how do I find just like the main points? And so I did just drop our Project 2025 page. We have a long explainer, a short explainer. We have the impact of the economic impact of Project 2025 short explainer. There are sites on the website as to where we pull the information, so you can share that out with your friends. But I think you just leaned into something, Kyle, that I think I hear a lot, is that when I talk to my friends about this, they think I'm hyperbolic, which is the same way they said before Roe was overturned. But what would you like tell people who are watching tonight, like when you try to have conversations with people about this and they say you're being hyperbolic? And you kind of just alluded to that, but is there anything else you want to add?
I mean, first of all, I want to say that one of the problems, I've been writing about the radical right, and so have my colleagues for, 6 or 7 years now. And when you talk about the radical right, you sound like a conspiracy theorist, because they work in this interconnected ecosystem, and they're all connected to each other, and they're so organized, and they're so systematic, and they work state to state in a way that, like, it is a conspiracy. So you sound like a conspiracy theorist. So first, like, just give yourself a break. Like, everybody faces this, and there's a reason, because they are conspiring. They are conspiring in an incredibly well-organized way. And so you sound like a lunatic when you're like telling people what they're doing. So for that reason, I think it's really important, again, focus on what the people in your community care about. Focus on the people in your community care about. So for example, and focus on the things they care about. So I tell journalists locally, in order to really show the impact of Project 2025 and the impacts it can have on our environment because of the global warming denying and the parts of the project that would shut down funding for, would open up drilling, open all over the country and shut down any efforts to deal with global warming. I point to lakes in a community. A lake that your friends like to go to, a hike they like to do, a national park they like. Shutting down the EPA and various other agencies will ensure that that lake is not cleaned. If you live in a community where there's lots of conversations about the watershed, make it clear that the federal agencies that help your community clean up that watershed, to test the watershed, to give your community documents to help them to figure out ways to do that, they'll be gone. No type of assistance from the federal government that comes down for that type of stuff is going to happen. So if a person cares about the natural resources in the community, you can talk about that. If you know that people care about other members of the community who are in the LGBTQ community, you can talk about that. If you know friends who have kids with special needs, explain to them their kids are not going to get the services that they deserve if this thing passes. Also, if you live in a state where you have a lot of issues with weather, the plan is to shut down the National Weather Service or curtail its what it does, so to a very, very small percentage. What that means, one of the things that Project 2025 wants to do is to keep the National Weather Service from telling you when a hurricane is coming your way. So that's something to tell people. This cutting of agencies is really, really going to hurt us in very personal ways.
Yeah, cutting FEMA is just makes no sense whatsoever. But all right, so I know I'm sure Julie is probably nodding her head that we have a ton of questions in the chat. So I'm gonna ask one last thing and we're gonna jump to questions. But you've laid all this stuff out. Obviously, this is a big impact if Trump wins. So what are you telling people to do to stop this movement from happening?
I'm telling people to vote. I'm telling people they've got to register and they've got to vote. What I've been telling people is if if you're in a swing state or a swing district, legislatively, or or you're trying to deal with your state legislature and deal with radicals in your state legislature, you want to find 10 friends that you can tell about this and make sure that they vote. And then you want to find, we all know those friends who are leaders, right? A couple of our friends, 4, 5, 3, 2, whatever, a couple of friends who we know are influencers. Those, you've got to tell them you need to go find 10 people. So have it blossom out. You tell 10 friends, you be responsible for 10 people and getting them to vote. And then a couple of those friends, you say, Laura, come on, I know everybody, Mahjong listens to you. You've got to make sure that they go, or I know your golf team, or I know you're this, or I know the women you run with. You need to get them all to vote. You need to be responsible for them. That's my advice. I know you guys have advice.
Well, actually, you're singing my song. That's relational organizing, and that's what Red, White, and Blue does. We have a Rally Your Squad program, and we have a tool to help you reach out to your friends. We will give you info like on Project 2025 Explainers, things to share on social media to start those conversations. So if you want to sign up for that and get involved, no matter where you live, I'm dropping the link in the chat. We're actually having an event on that Monday night. You can come check it out, but there's a toolkit you can download so you can figure out how to get on it, or reach out to any of us at Red, Wine, and Blue, volunteer at redwine.blue. And I know the other big question in the chat, which I'm just going to answer, is that they were asking, how do I talk to my friend who's really entrenched in this, or who's MAGA or QAnon? You don't. You're not going to change their mind. Let's not focus on them. You need to talk to people that actually you can have an impact with, who will get out to vote for common sense candidates. I'm going to bring Julie up so we can try to power through as many questions as we can. I know that we have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah, well, and I'm so glad that you brought up Monday night. Can't emphasize that enough. That was one of the big things in the chat. Someone was feeling very despondent. please, please come Monday night. And, because somebody mentioned postcards and phone banking, and what we do here at Red Wine and Blue is so much more effective than that. And we'll tell you about that on Monday, but please come Monday night. Okay, with that, folks were asking about, can he do any of this stuff as president without Congress okaying it?
So I think what you're going to see is like executive orders, right? You're going to see that potentially. You're also, I mean, we know that the Supreme Court recently ruled that, basically the president is above the law, and anything he does in his presidential capacities, he cannot be tried or charged for. So that's also kind of this Supreme Court that he has architected has now given him kind of carte blanche, which makes the threat that he would do things without Congress more possible. I don't want to be a doomer gloomer, but I'm going to be a doomer gloomer. We never thought Roe would be overturned. We never thought that the Supreme Court would suddenly decide the president was above the law. We just don't know what's coming down the pike, and we have to expect the worst. We really do. We have to expect this guy. What did he just tell a group of people? He told them, vote now, and you'll never have to vote again. This is a very, very scary and dangerous individual, and we really don't know what he will do, but we have to assume that he will do anything that he can to stay in power and give the folks who have supported him and gotten him into office the power they want. And that's these Christian nationalists.
Julie, will you please put the events thing in the email when you send that out, because somebody missed the beginning?
Sure.
Okay, so one of the questions that someone asked is, has the National Council of Churches taken a stance on any of this? Have they come out and said anything?
Well, I will say this, and I don't know if other folks have heard this, but one of the things that happened was that the Latter-day Saints, did anybody see this? That the Latter-day Saints recently came out and said that they are now opposing Trump and supporting Harris. And that is going to be so, so important, because the Latter-day Saints are extremely populous in Arizona, which is a state that we care a lot about. And it's a population that I know from my work with Turning Point USA and with other radical Republicans in Arizona, that they have really, really relied on that population to vote for them. So I think what we're seeing now are these Christian churches who are maybe were quiet or didn't want to get involved in politics, standing up and saying, no, we have to get involved, engaged, and we have to stand up and say, this is wrong, this is not Christianity, and we've got to get political.
Somebody asked about, I think it's Ziklag. I don't know what that is. Do you know anything about that?
I'm sorry?
Ziklag, Ziklag. I might have spelled it wrong.
No, I don't.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, Ziklag is what she put. So, but you don't know anything about it?
No.
Okay. All right. How much do you think that Christian nationalism is converting or reaching Republicans and independents?
It's a kooky idea, right? It's fringe. And so I think what we're seeing more than Christian nationalists reaching out to moderate Republicans who want to vote for Trump, we're seeing more of these. Like, one tactic I'm seeing with folks is, they just turn a blind eye. They don't want to believe it. They don't want to see it. They want to vote for Trump for some reason. His fiscal plans, whatever. They want low taxes, and so they just completely shut it down and don't look at it. I think if they paid attention, they would find it really scary. But I'm seeing a kind of like denial. I think you're seeing more with those types of folks, denial, rather than, taking it in, getting converted.
And then I know you spoke about this a bit, but folks were talking about how we need to continue to educate about this, because this is not just about Trump, and that they're still going to try to get things done at the local level, where they've been getting folks on city councils and in school boards, which is another thing that we talk about when Julie and I do training as well. But, I do know that that is something that they have been working on. So, what are your thoughts on that
Yeah.
about the long-term implications?
Yeah, so I mean, Project 2025 is a plan that they would like Trump to execute on. Trump, as many of us know, is not a religious man in any way, shape, or form. He's not a Christian nationalist either. He's a vehicle. He's a vessel, and that's the way they see him. They see him in very utilitarian terms. So this is not a plan. We call it the MAGA plan. We call it Trump's plan because that's who would implement it if Trump is elected. If Trump is not elected, they will hold this plan and hope to elect somebody next time who will execute on this plan nationally. But remember that people, like someone noted in the chat, Josh Hawley, there are many people who consider themselves Christian nationalists, or we would consider Christian nationalists, who are already in the Senate and the House. And so they will continue to try to do their work there. But Christian nationalism and the Project 2025, as I noted before, is already being seen in the states, in these red states with Christian nationalist state legislatures. They are passing these laws and they are robbing people of rights, and suppressing people's voices and robbing people of their reproductive rights and arming people and robbing people of the right of to be free of gun violence. So the plan always with this particular group of people is to work federally, to work on the courts, to work in the state legislatures, to work on the school boards, right? They're everywhere. And one thing that you see them do a lot is they create legislation together, and then that legislation goes around the country. So what I always say to people is, if you're seeing it in your neighboring state, it's coming to you.
So what are the international implications if he were to win and 2025 is enacted?
What would happen? Yeah. I mean, I think that the fear that we have right now is that nationalism is very, very appealing around the country. I mean, around the world. And that Trump in particular seems to have a real affinity to authoritarian figures like Putin, obviously, Orban, other figures like that. So I think the fear is that if Trump is elected, we will see our foreign policy veering more and more into this realm in which we look at a Russia and some of these other countries not as enemies that we need to keep away from and protect ourselves from, but potential allies. And so in that regard, I think we ought to be very, very worried. We live in a very small world now, right? And we see that right now. We see trends that pass very quickly from one country to the next. And I think this movement, this nationalist movement, is an international movement. And Trump has his allies around the world.
Do you think that it's helpful to discuss the origins of Christian nationalism when, when you're talking with people? Do you think that that's a helpful way to talk with them about all this?
To talk about the origins of it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you can. That's if you have somebody who really wants a history lesson. I feel like, understanding how it came up, really in the 20s, it was when it was really people started, this group of people started thinking about this idea of Christian nationalism, and then it sort of waned, it waxed and waned, and then we saw Paul Weyrich in the 80s, the 70s and the 80s start to develop it and grow it. I think that the most effective way to talk about Christian nationalism is to talk about how it will impact you. Do you want the 10 Commandments in your school? Do you want your child to be learning a mandatory Bible teachings? Do you believe in the separation of church and state, which is enshrined in our Constitution? So do you want us to preserve our Constitution or not? I do. I really believe that we should talk about it. Do you want the young neighbor who has special services to get those special services? Do you want your grandkids to be able to swim in the local lake? These are all things that would be threatened if Project 2025 was enacted. So I say talk to people about the things that they really care about, and pick one or two. I say to my friends, I can't do this to my daughter. I must vote against Trump because my daughter's rights are going to be so violated if Trump comes into office. Already in many states, if she got pregnant, trying to get her an abortion could be arrested. And this has happened, and we're seeing this happen in Texas and other states. So I talk about it in very personal terms. I can't do this to my daughter, and we shouldn't do it to your daughter.
I
And
agree.
we all have our own, personal way of talking about it, but a heart, we got to talk to the heart. We got to talk to people's hearts, and we're most of us are parents or have younger people in our lives that we care about, and those I think are top of mind for many of us.
I agree. Well, we are right at time, Julie, so I will kick it back to you.
I'm trying to answer things in the chat, so I'm like multitasking here, but I do want to end on this because I know this has been a really heavy topic. So I know a lot of you are sitting here going, but maybe Kyle, just like what gives you hope? And I can just say, for me, it's the enthusiasm we're seeing. It's those crowds that are turning out surrounding airplanes. And also the fact that a couple of weeks ago, we did an event with Heather Cox Richardson about this. And at that time, 71% of Americans had never heard of Project 2025. That has changed a lot. And when they hear about it, they don't like it. So the fact that you all are here are learning all this information that you can go and share with your friends. And this is why I'm so happy that Kyle is saying, emphasize the things that they care about, give them those bite-sized chunks so that they can look it up themselves and understand this is how we win. And that's why it's so helpful. And I appreciate all of you listening to the scary information so that we can go and actually make a difference. Kyle, I'll let you have the last word on that. If there's anything you want to add or things giving you hope as you talk to people. She's traveling the country talking about this.
Yeah, I have to say that when I first saw Project 2025, I actually gathered with a bunch of pro-democracy authors in the spring, and it's this 900-page document, and we sat around for 48 hours trying to figure out how to talk about it to people and how to spread the word, and we all went our separate ways to do different things. But it's an overwhelming document, and the fact that so many people in this country have taken that 900-page document, summarized it, done videos, shared it with their friends, policy papers, on TV, on podcasts. It's unbelievable. It's becoming a household name. It's such an, they did this to us on purpose. They dumped this huge document on us because it was so hard to explain to people, but we are figuring out how to explain it. And we're building the ship as we go. And I think that's the beauty of our movement. That's the beauty of our progressive movement, of Democrats, of this big tent that we belong to. We are building the ship as we go, and we're going to win this thing because we care so much about sharing with our neighbors what is not only the threat, but what are the possibilities. And I think that's the story now, the Kamala story is we can talk about the possibilities and what we can have. We don't want to go backwards. That's what Project 2025 is. It's going backwards. We want to go forward, and we have a vision for the future. And so that is giving me a lot of hope.
Please go check out our website, which is redwine.blue. You can find Project 2025 on there, an explainer. You can find the events. So Monday night, we have our Rally Your Squad event. We have Jess McIntosh coming, who does messaging about how to talk to people. So all of these things are very helpful, and Rally Your Squad is really your way that you can have a tool and a platform that really helps you be effective. And we, like I said, we are going to give you great messaging and things to send to people. This is how we make a difference. Kyle is right. Talk to 5 people, talk to 5 more, keep going. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to Kyle. Round of applause for all the amazing information. Thank you, Julie, for wrangling all those questions in the chat. And everybody have go have a good rest of your evening. Okay. Find something light and fun to watch or something. So, okay. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, guys.